Hello, so the next little part of this topic then is the carbon cycle, and we're also going to look at global warming. Now, if we get started off here, we need to look at the carbon cycle because it's an important nutrient cycle. Now, carbon, the element, is present in lots of different compounds. The types of compounds that it's present in is carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So naturally it's going to get cycled between the different organisms in an ecosystem. As well as that, it's also present in carbon dioxide, which is in the air. And of course you'll remember carbon dioxide is produced in respiration. Now, just before we go any further, the carbohydrates it's found in is glucose, which is produced in photosynthesis, starch, and also cellulose. So, carbon's in a lot of things. So let's have a look at how it's transferred between living organisms and how it's cycled around an ecosystem. Now, one of the first things I think it's important to do is remember two equations that we've come across so far this year: photosynthesis and respiration. And what you'll remember is that they are pretty much opposites of each other. So in photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water are used to produce glucose plus oxygen. And then in respiration, glucose and oxygen react together to form carbon dioxide and water. Now, of these four substances, carbon dioxide and glucose both contain carbon. So that's the first little thing that we're going to look at in the carbon cycle. Now, my advice before we start this is to pause the video here and get a piece of paper or a whiteboard and draw this along with me. So, this is going to be the carbon cycle then. So, as I say, we start with carbon dioxide in the air, and it gets taken in by plants in the process of photosynthesis. So the plants absorb the carbon dioxide and they make carbohydrates. Now, of course, plants are living things, so they can also respire, which basically breaks up the glucose which they've produced and releases the carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Now, the plants can also get eaten by animals, and that transfers the carbon compounds from the plants to the animals. So let's say, for example, that the plants contain starch. They get eaten by the animals. Now, what do the animals do with that? They digest the starch, break it up into glucose, and then they can use the glucose for respiration because, of course, they're living things, so they have to respire. Now, of course, plants and animals have to die at some point, and animals also release waste or excrete waste in the form of feces or urine. Now, this can't just accumulate. We can't have just loads of dead plants and animals all over the place with loads of peas and poos everywhere. So that's up to the decomposers to break down the dead material and the waste and recycle it back for different organisms. Now, as well as that, decomposers are also living things, so they can respire. Sometimes though, if there's not enough oxygen available, fossilization takes place, and that's how fossil fuels were produced. So the three main types are coal, oil, and gas. Now you can then take those fossil fuels and you can burn them in a process known as combustion, and that releases energy and carbon dioxide. Now that's a lot to take in one go. So let's have a look at how you would go about actually drawing this out. You'd start off with the 5 main areas where you find carbon compounds, which is the atmospheric carbon dioxide or the air, plants, animals, decomposers, and fossil fuels. And then you try and get the arrows that join them up. So there's an arrow going from the air to plants, which is photosynthesis, and one going back again, which is respiration. We've also got one going from plants to animals, which is feeding, and then one from plants to decomposers, one from animal to decomposers, and one from animals to atmospheric CO2. You then have one going from decomposers to fossil fuels, and then one up from fossil fuels to CO2, and then a final one at the other side from decomposers to CO2. So what I would do here is I would pause that and practice drawing out those 5 areas with the arrows that connect them, and then the next step is going to be putting names to them. So pause it and run through it. So check that you've got these in. We've got the 5 areas, we've got 2 arrows here, an arrow here and here, another one there, another one, and then 2 final ones. And that's the carbon cycle. Now, pause it here and see if you can remember the names of any of these processes. Now, the blue ones, I'll give you a clue, are all the same process because they're all living things, so they all have to carry this out. Pause it, see if you can name them. So we've got photosynthesis, respiration, feeding, respiration, death and excretion, death, fossilization, combustion, and respiration. Now, what you should be able to do in an exam question is a speed draw. So let's say, for example, a question comes up in the carbon cycle. It looks totally different from one that you've seen before. You need to be able to draw it out so you can apply your knowledge. So we've got carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We've got plants. And the process that takes place is photosynthesis. The plants get eaten by the animals. And that's called feeding. The animals and plants die and produce waste. This dead material goes to decomposers, and at 3 stages here we have got living organisms, so that means that respiration must take place, because otherwise those organisms would die. Then some of the dead material doesn't decompose, instead it produces fossil fuels in the process of fossilization. Fossil fuels can be burnt in the process of combustion, and that's the carbon cycle. So we can get that down even smaller, where we've got CO2, plants, animals, decomposers, fossil fuels. We've got the arrows joining them up. We've got respiration here, photosynthesis, feeding, respiration, respiration, death and excretion, death, fossilization, combustion. Now, that took about 30 seconds. It will seriously help you out. So practice drawing it again and again and again until you can get it down to that sort of speed. Now, just for the sake of completeness here, let's just look at each process and make sure we understand what's going on. So the first one is photosynthesis, which is where carbon dioxide is taken in by plants and built up into sugar and starch and other organic molecules. So remember there, the equation is carbon dioxide plus water produces glucose plus oxygen. So carbon dioxide was taken in and it's built up into glucose. The glucose can then be converted into starch. The animals eat the plants or other animals, and the carbon is built up into other organic compounds that can be transferred further along the food chain. So like I was saying, the animals eat the plants, that digest the starch, release the glucose, and then can use it for respiration. Then, respiration takes place when plants, animals, decomposers respire and return the carbon compounds to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Decomposition takes place when the dead organisms are broken up into simpler products, and that is usually done by decomposers. The decomposers also respire because they are living organisms, which returns carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And finally then, combustion is when the fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, are burnt and carbon goes back in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Fossil fuels were formed millions of years ago, and they did not decay but were preserved in a process called fossilization due to the conditions that were present at that time. Now, problem with the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle is that no matter what diagram you look at or you're given, it's always slightly different. So that's why you need to be able to apply your knowledge. So if we start off here with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, how does it get into organic compounds in the plants? That process is photosynthesis. The plants are then eaten and the organic compounds are transferred to the animals. Then the plants can also die and release material which can be broken up by microbes or decomposers. That's also going to happen here, but we're going to have death and excretion this time as well. Now, the reason why we're including excretion here is because the plants can die, but they don't really produce any urine or feces, which is the main carbon compounds here that we're talking about. As well as that, fossilization will take place to produce fossil fuels. Fossil fuels can be burnt, and respiration takes place from both microbes, plants, and animals. Typical questions then. What are the only processes that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? The only one is photosynthesis. It's the only one which can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. What are the two processes that increase the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? It's respiration and combustion. Now, the next little part then shows you a typical question. So pause it here, use your wee whiteboard, see if you can work out the answers. So A should be photosynthesis, B should be respiration. Now sometimes these can be a little bit confusing. Death and waste being converted into atmospheric CO2 can either be respiration by the decomposers, or it can be decomposition. Name processes A, B and C. So again, pause it and try and work it out. So A is respiration, B is fossilization, C is combustion. Another one then, name A, B and C. So A is respiration, B is fossilization, and C is combustion. Name the only process which decreases carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is photosynthesis. Another one here then, name processes A, B and C. So A is combustion, B is photosynthesis, and C is respiration. Now, just for another bit of practice, write out the numbers 1 to 8 and see if you can name every process. So, 1 is photosynthesis, 2 is respiration, 3 is respiration, 4 is respiration, 5 is feeding, 6 is death, 7 is death and excretion, 8 is fossilization, and 9 is combustion. Now, as you can see in each of these, the problem has been that you never see the same diagram twice. So make sure that you have the ability to draw out a really quick carbon cycle that you can use to apply your knowledge in exams. Now, there's lots of environmental issues around the carbon cycle. Pretty much over the last 150 years, the carbon cycle has become imbalanced. So, in previous times, you used to be able to rely on there being way more plants than all the other processes. So there was always carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere. But over the last 150 years, there has been increased combustion of fossil fuels, which adds more CO2 to the atmosphere, and more deforestation, which is chopping down trees and forests. So less photosynthesis can take place. So the carbon cycle is unbalanced. Now that has led to global warming. Global warming, we've heard loads about it. It's always in the news. So here's how it actually happens. Now remember, we're saying it happens because of more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than normal from combustion of fossil fuels, and also from deforestation. So deforestation is important because there is less photosynthesis taking place. Now the reason global warming is taking place is because of the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect is caused by greenhouse gases, the main examples of which are carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapour. Now, one of the biggest ones, or the biggest offenders, is carbon dioxide. Now, the greenhouse gases form this layer around the Earth. And here's what happens. So heat from the sun can pass through the atmosphere. The Earth's surface heats up. So the Earth's surface heats up. Some of the heat is reflected back into space, which is shown by this arrow over here. But the greenhouse gases stop some of the heat escaping. So the planet heats up, or global temperatures rise. Now, as I say, carbon dioxide isn't the only greenhouse gas. There's also methane, which is produced by cows, rice fields, and some of it is even frozen in the sea. The last one, the methane being frozen in the sea, is actually more of an issue now because global temperatures are rising, which is causing the release of more methane, so the problem will get worse before it gets better. And the water vapour as well, so the clouds and water in the air. Now the effects of global warming then is climate change. Polar ice caps are melting, which then causes increased flooding, and there's also more land to become desert. There is also two really important points. Because there's more flooding and the land becoming desert, there is a loss of habitats. Now, what effect do you think this has on biodiversity? You'll remember we talked about biodiversity in the first ecology unit, where we said that biodiversity was the range of different animals and plants in a certain area. Well, if you've got less habitats caused by more desert, more flooding, and polar ice caps melting, biodiversity will decrease because there will be less habitats and less food sources for organisms, so biodiversity will also decrease. So the effects of global warming then again, just to reiterate the point, we get more droughts or an increase in global temperatures. You get more flooding caused by polar ice caps melting. And this is what can be done to reduce it. Plant more trees. So there is more photosynthesis, and then there will be more CO2 removed. You reduce deforestation. So again, that pretty much goes along with this. And then burn less fossil fuels by using alternative fuels and or becoming more energy efficient. So burn less fossil fuels, which releases carbon dioxide, by using alternative fuels, e.g. hydrogen, or becoming more energy efficient. So that could be things like turning off the lights when you're not using them, get your home better insulated, so you need to burn less fossil fuels, and lots of things like that. And that's the end of this little section. The next little one is on the nitrogen cycle. Goodbye.